Hello. This week we are looking at Chapter 7 Airlines. Last week we looked at the other two types of modes of transportation, and that was railroad and motor carriers. But today we're going to look at airlines, and then we will also look at water carriers and pipelines in Chapter 8. For Chapter 7, you need to be familiar with these objectives. When you read through the chapter and view the chapter materials, you need to appreciate the importance of air transportation in the U.S. economy, gain knowledge of the types and number of carriers in the U.S. airline industry, and understand the level of competition in the U.S. airline industry, and become aware of the operating and service characteristics of airline transportation. Be familiar with the different types of equipment used by airlines, appreciate the impacts of fuel and labor costs on airline cost structures, and understand the concepts of economies of scale and density in the airline industry, and be aware of current issues that face the airlines today. So as you review those objectives, think about a couple of things. So think of this. From the very first flight, which lasted less than a minute, to space shuttles orbiting the Earth, air transportation has come a long way in a short period of time. You think about back to the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville. They made their first flight in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, and then they sold their invention to the federal government. Then in 1908, the development of air transportation began with the U.S. Post Office and examining the feasibility of providing airmail service. So airplanes were used in World War II, World War I, but the use of airplanes for mail transport can be considered the beginning of the modern airline industry. Passenger transportation services developed as a byproduct of the mail business and began to flourish in certain markets. So airplanes have become faster, bigger, and relatively more fuel efficient. But the level and degree of technological improvement have slowed in the airline industry. There's still opportunity for further innovation. So our job in this course is to correlate that to how that is a part of the supply chain. Let's look at an industry overview and significance. So as of 2007, the for-hire air carriers have total operating revenues of $1.73.1 billion, of which $1.7 billion came from passenger service. And in 2003, air carriers transported 15.2 billion revenue ton miles, or approximately 0.4% of total intercity ton miles. We're going to look at the types of carriers. So there's the for-hire carriers that can't easily be categorized into specific types because carriers provide many types of services, all cargo, air taxi, commuter, charter, and international, and annual revenue, majors, nationals, and regionals. There's a classification that's frequently used by U.S. air carriers and one based on annual operating revenues. The categories used to classify those air carriers is the majors, with annual revenues of more than $1 billion, nationals, with annual revenues of $100 million to $1 billion. And then we have our regionals. Those are the annual revenues of less than $100 million. So the charter carriers are also known as air taxis, and they use small to medium-sized aircraft to transport people or freight. And that supplemental carrier has no time schedule or a designated route. So the carrier charters the entire plane to transport a group of people or cargo between specified origins and destinations. Many of the U.S. carriers are also international carriers and operate between the continental U.S. and foreign countries. A look at carrier revenue shows a concentration of earnings by a small group of majors, nationals, and regionals. And the majority of air movements are made by 151 carriers. And so private air transportation has been estimated to include approximately 60,000 company-owned planes, with over 500 U.S. corporations owning a private air fleet. Now, the deregulation in 1978 was expected to result in a larger number of airlines, but that number of major airlines did increase initially. But if you look at Table 7.1 in your book, it shows the number of airlines have remained steady over the last several years. So when you look at that chart, I want you to notice that as well. So hopefully, as I'm lecturing, you do have your book with you and you're kind of reading along as I talk about the major points of the chapters. So the table 7.1, and I want you to note those tables are very important to look at on page 230 of your book. Now, we talk about the types and the numbers of carriers, but let's look at competition. So we have the two types. You're going to see these two terms a lot, intermodal and intramodal. So since air carrier is a unique service, they do face limited competition from other modes for other passengers or freight, as they have the advantage of providing time-sensitive long-distance movement of people or freight. Then you've got the intramodal, and that competition in rates and service among the air carriers is very intense, and the number of carriers is very small. And so the top 10 carriers account for about 80% of the total operating revenue. But sometimes with that excess capacity, airline prices have fallen to 3.0% in '07, and that's not adjusted for inflation. And so during the same period, inflation rose to 2.8%, and that's measured by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Then we look at service competition, and there's many forms of that. There's on-time arrival and friendly employees to convince travelers that has the desired quality of service and incentives for the consumer. And then there's cargo competition. Competition for cargo is very intense nowadays. There's major airline companies like FedEx and UPS Airlines, and they have their own fleets of service delivery vehicles perform the ground portion of the door-to-door service. All right, so this is a great example. How many of you all probably have bought something or you buy something from Amazon? I've been a very faithful Amazon.com customer since 2000, near 2000. And it's amazing how you get on there, you order your stuff, and then 2 or 3 days later, depending on your shipping that you choose, it's there. A lot of that stuff from Amazon.com is actually transported through the air. So again, it's kind of interesting to see how Amazon has become this huge company, but air freight has been a huge part, a very significant part of their company's practices and their supply chain. It's very interesting. That's why I always like to study Amazon, because they have, just like Walmart, they're in almost every part, every sector of the supply chain, every sector of the transportation industry. All right, let's look at operating and service characteristics. In general, the major revenue source for air carriers is passenger transportation. Just think about our airlines. In '07, approximately 61.8% of total operating revenues were derived from passenger transportation. And then in '07, again, approximately 14.2% of the total operating revenues were generalized from freight transportation. And for those emergency shipments, the cost of air transportation is often inconsequential compared to the cost of delaying the goods. And then we have the speed of service, and that's always a major service advantage. For example, with a trip from New York to California trip, approximately 2,000 miles, it's a mere 6-hour journey. And this also is the advantage of high terminal speed that has been dampened somewhat by reduced frequency of flights. Air carriers have been concentrating their services on high density routes like New York and Chicago, while implementing the hub and spoke terminal approach, which has aggravated the air traffic congestion and ground congestion at major airports. The shippers who use air carriers to transport freight, they are interested in the speed and reliability of service. Think about Amazon again. And also the resultant benefits like your reduced inventory levels. Now, the length of haul capacity for passenger travel, air carriers dominate the long distance moves. In '07, the average length of haul for passenger travel was 1,078 miles for air carriers. Adding freight to the baggage compartment on passenger flights, it necessitates rather small size shipments and supports rate making practices for these shipments. And then we talk about reliability, dependability, and accessibility. So sometimes if you have adverse weather conditions, air carriers are capable of providing reliable service, but sophisticated navigational instrumentation permits operation during most weather conditions. And then there's poor accessibility is one disadvantage of air carriers, and passengers and freight must be transported to an airport for air service to be rendered. Then you've got your equipment, the types of vehicles. There's several different sizes of airplanes, from small commuter planes to huge wide-body four-engine planes by the nationals. Terminals, their airports are financed by the government entity. They pay for the carriers pay for the use of the airport through various fees, and users pay a tax on airline tickets and air freight charges. Then we're going to look at the cost structure, fixed versus variable cost components. The cost structures for air carriers consist of a high variable and a low fixed cost of approximately 80% variable and 20% fixed. And then flying operations accounted for 37.9% of airline operating costs in '07. And then you're going to talk about the fuel. And the escalating fuel costs have caused problems in the past by the airlines. And by December 2007, the price per gallon of aviation fuel was $2.10 per gallon. I challenge you guys to do a quick Google search to see what those averages were as of December 2017 and December 2018. See if you can find that and send me an email. Let me know what those newest prices are. All right. On labor, in 2007, the average salaries and wages increased 2.7%, but were offset by a reduction in the average benefits and pensions of 11.9%. In 2007, the employers carried 560,997 people at an average annual compensation of $74,786. Again, I challenge you to see what those 2017-2018, if available, averages are. Wages paid to a pilot usually vary according to the pilot's equipment rating, and wages can also vary according to whether a person works for a union airline or not. Just kind of like most industries. So these are some interesting things to ponder. Now let's look at one other thing. Let's look at the equipment. So the cost of operating airplanes varies with larger planes, but there's more cost to operate per hour than smaller planes, but the cost per seat mile is lower for larger planes. When we think about the economies of scale, and we talked about the economies of scale for the railroads and motor carriers, now the large-scale air carrier operations do have some economies of scale. They result from more extensive use of large-sized plane or indivisible units. Market conditions or that sufficient demand must exist to permit the efficient utilization of larger planes. If the planes are flown near capacity, the seat mile cost will obviously decrease. And there's another factor that comes into play, and that's the large-scale operations for air carriers is the integrated communication network that's required for activities like your operating controls and passenger reservations. All right, so we looked a little bit about the economies of scales. We're also going to look at the rates and the pricing. The airline pricing for passenger services is characterized by the discounts from full fare. Their seats on the same plane can have substantially different prices depending on restrictions attached to the purchase. And business people usually pay more for their airline travel due to the more rigid schedules now and the fact that they usually depart and return during the high demand times. And we're going to look at the operating efficiency, and there is a very, very simple equation. So you got your operating ratio equals operating expense divided by operating income times of 100. So as we look at that, we want to see how that can be very much calculated. And if you look on page 244 of your textbook, the operating ratio, that's the important measure of operating efficiency used by air carriers. And the operating ratio measures the portion of operating income that goes to operating expense. And then you also have the load factor, and that's equal to the number of passengers divided by the total number of seats times 100. So sometimes airlines have used this measure of operating efficiency. It's also the load factor. That's what most airlines use, or air carriers. And then also airlines have raised plane load factors to the 70-80% range. And the particular route and type of plane, the capacity directly affects that load factor, as is your price, service level, and that competition. Equipment substitution might not be possible. A substitution might result in excess capacity. So as we go further towards the end of the chapter, we have looked at everything about the transportation sector for airlines. And we're also going to look at current issues, and that will kind of round out our chapter. Again, safety, security, and technology, just like with the other two modes that we have previously discussed, is always paramount to this industry. Airline safety is of great importance, especially since 9/11. We know that has really has impacted that. Airport security has reached an all-time high, and that has caused more delays at airport terminals. Now, as with other transportation modes, the issue of substance abuse concerning pilots and ground crews have become important as well. You have your security, and now after the aftermath of 9/11, it has risen in the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. Both of these agencies are responsible for safety of passengers while in airports in flight. And if you have traveled by air, you have probably been subjected to some of the security measures that the airport terminals have put in place, especially since 9/11. And then we're going to look at technology because the airline industry has to be quick and efficient in their service in order to attract business. And so there's more sophisticated equipment, and the FAA and federal government are purposing an entire overhaul of the current air traffic control system. So again, as you ponder the concepts of this chapter, I hope you'll see how it is such an important part of our supply chain.